Hello, Thursdeighties friends. It has been quite some time since my last episode. I wish I could say that I was super busy with work, or that I was on vacation, or that after achieving the high score on Starfighter, I was recruited by an alien that looked an awful lot like Harold Hill from The Music Man to help fight exciting space battles and protect the Rylan people from the Kodan Empire. However, it was none of those things. Instead, I proved myself a master at procrastination. I actually interviewed today's guest several months ago, and somehow managed to let way too much time pass before sharing our conversation with you. And for that, I apologize to all of you, but especially to my gracious guest, who I really enjoyed talking to and sharing great memories with. I've mentioned before on the podcast that growing up, I frequented a shop called The Bookstore in my hometown of Geneseo, Illinois. In a small town like Geneseo, with a population of 6,000 during the 80s, though I don't think that number has changed a whole lot in the past few decades, downtown businesses were usually family-owned and operated, meaning that on any given day that you walked through their doors, you'd end up in conversation with the owner, or owners, a member of their family, or someone who'd been a loyal employee for a generation or more. It was one of the things about growing up in a small Midwestern farm town that made that experience uniquely special, at least to me. Now, I haven't lived in Geneseo for nearly 40 years, and my favorite shop there, the bookstore, has been closed since the 90s, but I think about those days often. So when an old friend of mine announced that she and her husband were going to open a new bookstore in Geneseo, well, let me tell you, I don't think I could have been more excited if I was opening the store myself. Beth and Jim Nyland, the owners of the newly opened Anthology for Books in Geneseo, have done something that many of us only dream of doing. They've started a business that is both timely and retro, a bricks and mortar bookshop in a small town that both needs and supports small businesses, along with an online presence that extends their reach well beyond their small town borders. On top of all of that, Beth and Jim are two of the kindest, most down-to-earth folks I've ever known, and their love of reading shines like a beacon when you visit their store. So this should come as no surprise when I tell you that this episode of Thursdeighties is brought to you by Anthology for Books, Jim and Beth's brand new independent bookstore in Geneseo, Illinois. Anthology for Books isn't just a place to buy books. It's a quirky, fun destination where people come to hang out, make human connections, and discover great stories. For those of us who did grow up in the 80s, we can remember the magic of discovering a great book or a favorite new comic at the local bookstore. And remember the smell of those books, the creaking floor, the weird, wonderful people behind the counter? Well, through Anthology, my friends Beth and Jim are bringing that back. Whether you were into the classics, the latest bestsellers, or something a bit more offbeat, Anthology has something for everyone. And the best part? You don't have to be in Geneseo, Illinois to experience the magic. You can do business with them online at anthologyforbooks.com. That's anthology and the number 4, books.com. But if you ever find yourself passing through the charming little town of Geneseo, which is just off Interstate 80, a few miles east of the Mississippi, Beth and Jim would love for you to stop by, say hello, and join their community of book lovers. Mention that you heard about it on this podcast. You may not get a discount, but you'll get a hug. They are great huggers. Remember, at Anthology for Books, it's all about good reading and great relationships. Check them out online at Anthology for Books. Again, that's anthology and the number 4, books.com. Anthology for Books, where great people discover great stories, just like in our wonder years of the 80s. Okay, on with the show. I loved Starlog Magazine. It was always exciting to find a new issue on the newsstand, especially if I had a couple of dollars in my pocket to buy it, which was rare, but occasionally happened. It's sometimes hard to remember now, in a time where newsstands and printed magazines almost feel as dated as Betamax videotapes, but when Starlog Magazine founders Carrie O'Quinn and Norman Jacobs first published Starlog in 1976, they knew their audience. Sci-fi movie and TV fans who wanted real reporting and genuine behind-the-scenes news about the nuts and bolts of producing sci-fi entertainment. The genesis of that may have been Star Trek, pun intended, but by 1976, the world of sci-fi TV and movies was on the cusp of a change that no one could have predicted, and by the end of 1977, Star Wars had established itself as a bona fide phenomenon, and executives at Paramount were making the decision to turn their Star Trek intellectual property into its own motion picture series, which eventually led back to TV and Star Trek The Next Generation. And there was so much more. Starlog covered it all from 1976 until 2009. Today's Thursdeities guest first caught my attention when recently I found myself going down the internet rabbit hole of 70s and 80s sci-fi fandom, opening the floodgates to some serious nostalgia for me. Now that led to a search for back issues of Starlog Magazine, which is where I made two interesting discoveries. First, while back issues of Starlog Magazine are relatively easy to find at the moment, the publisher's warehouse holding all of the back issues of Starlog burned to the ground in 2007, leaving only those who still have issues that they collected back in the day as the sole source to acquire those back issues. Next, and most importantly, I discovered a book titled The Starlog Compendium, chronicling the contents of the first 200 issues of Starlog, published between 1976 and 1994. I was fascinated by the notion that someone felt so connected to this classic publication that they would go through the exhaustive effort to research and write such a book. On the surface, that indicated to me that the author was my kind of people, and I think I turned out to be really, really on the money on that one. So please give a big Thursdeities welcome to author, editor, podcaster, publisher, Renaissance man, John Zipperer. Hey, John.
Thank you very much. I'm so glad to be here.
We talked a bit before I hit record, and I mentioned, I'll say it again, the Starlog Compendium, and we'll talk all about that, but it was a joy to discover, and I appreciate so much the stewardship of pulling that information together for people like me who loved Starlog and really just can't get enough of that sort of classic sci-fi fandom, vintage nerdosity, I guess is what I'll call it.
Well, I figured there was some sort of an audience out there for it because I started doing it years ago, just on a blog. And it was honestly kind of a stressful time in my life. And to be able to have some time to like go through an old issue, kind of write it up and post it was nice. And then I started hearing from people from all over the place, including former Starlog editors and writers who liked what I was doing. And I also did it for a short-lived magazine Starlog did from like 78 to 82 called Future Life. And that was kind of, if any of your listeners, I remember Omni magazine. It was kind of in the same realm, kind of straddling science fiction and science. And it was really a great little magazine, but it only lasted 31 issues. So I kind of did this similar treatment for that magazine. And again, I was hearing from people from around the world and former editors and former writers and all. And it was interesting that not only are there the former readers of the magazines like you and I who enjoyed it, but it does seem like that the people who worked on them, that was kind of a special time in their life, even though they've all obviously gone on to do other things, to run other organizations, to work in other magazines, to become best-selling writers. It really was a time where I think they were at a moment of, changes in the cultural zeitgeist of what was happening and obviously popular culture. But then also at this publication, which in the magazine world, which doesn't really exist anymore, Starlog was a fairly small publication, circulation between maybe 100 and 225,000, as opposed to millions for the big magazine. But it was a magazine that if you were doing anything in science fiction, books, movies, TV, you read. And that included increasingly the people who were producing books and magazines and TV. And I think a large part of it was a magazine that talked about, let's just stick with movies, was talking about how movies were made.
Right. Right.
And it wasn't about, oh, this movie star is sleeping with that movie star and this producer is arguing with, having a big money fight with his lawyer or whatever. It's
nuts and bolts.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes the personal stuff kind of gets interwoven in there, but I mean, that wasn't why you read the magazine. That wasn't why they would want to do an article. That was maybe someone talking about their life as they're interviewed. But yeah, it was really about how movies were made. And you learned a lot as a reader. And Starlog would once in a while get criticism from people who wanted them to be more, if it was a movie someone hated, they wanted that magazine to really just go after it And Starlog, occasionally you could tell what their editors thought. They didn't like a certain movie or TV series or something, you know. They hated Buck Rogers in the 25th century. They hated Battlestar Galactica. But if you read their articles, you, the reader, really were able to kind of get a good sense of, oh, okay, Buck Rogers is going to be kind of a humorous take on this old hero.
Right.
You know, Battlestar Galactica is going to be laden with mythological stories and stuff like that. Obviously, awesome special effects. You really got a good sense of being able to determine if this was going to be good or not. And then, of course, at the end, it all just comes down to either like it or you don't like it, and you don't care what someone else say. If Harlan Ellison doesn't like your favorite TV series, so what?
So hold on that thought for a moment. It's always critical that I start by asking some vital 80s questions. These are kind of Coke or Pepsi questions. Don't worry about thinking too hard about them. I use this as a way to level set on what you were zoned in on in the 80s. So what was John Zipperer's favorite movie in the 80s?
I'm going to bookend the decade, so I'm going to give you two. They're related. One was Raiders of the Lost Ark and Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. I can watch those movies so many times. It's silly.
See, and that's why at the outset of the podcast, I said you were my kind of people, and I would 1,000% agree on Raiders. It's a little bit, Last Crusade is not my favorite, but I'll take Indiana Jones all day long and twice on Tuesday. Great choice. Next, favorite 80s television show.
Okay, this is completely out of left field considering we're mostly talking science fiction and comics here. LA Law.
Wow.
That show debuted, of course, in the late 80s. It was by the producer of
Stephen Bochco.
Three Blues. And it was this amazing thing where it was the hot show that, of course, every actor wanted to be on. So, you'd be watching it and like the judge is like this super famous actor who's just kind of doing this one-off thing that they're on, 20% of this episode. And I think people forget how we've had, with all the political and cultural upheaval we've had in the country over the past, especially the past 5 years, people forget that even back in the 80s, which are often criticized as being, this very conservative cultural time, and people felt they weren't able to talk about stuff. Well, it's like LA Law was dealing with homosexuality, with police brutality, with racism, with gender roles and all this kind of stuff. And they were doing it for, top 10 primetime NBC audiences.
Yeah, that was appointment television of the time. And I know it's easy to forget after all these years when everything is 24/7 accessible, but you stopped what you were doing and you watched. And if you missed it, you missed it. Now you might have a VCR and you could tape it, but if you were seeing it first run, then you were in the know and you felt like you were energized about what you were going to talk about the next day.
Exactly. You had that moment of, oh my God, did they just do that? And you couldn't wait to tell your friends and whoever about it.
All right. And the last of the 80s questions, favorite music or musician of the 80s?
A friend of mine in high school was being fed music by, I don't know, it was a relative of his or a friend of his who was a little bit older. So I think off at college. And he gave me some cassettes that he had copied from me. He had just filled the backside with Alphaville, which was this German synth band, forever young, jet set, big in Japan. I still love the band. I had the distinct pleasure of going to Berlin in 2001 and interviewing Marianne Gold, the lead singer. That's probably the band that most sticks out to me and really love, but also I'll cheat and add in a second one, which is Talking Heads.
Well, all of those answers, absolutely correct. You are going to go to the next round. Spoiler alert, everybody gets past this first round. So, well, we touched on it just a little bit, but the first real question I had for you, and I discovered this as I kind of looked back into your bio when I first saw your name on the Starlog Compendium. You're a Midwesterner like myself. I'd love to hear a bit about your origin story.
I have ping-ponged all across the country really throughout my life. I was born in Madison, Wisconsin, We lived just outside it, in a smaller town called Sun Prairie, but basically a suburb of it. But then in 1970, my parents got divorced.
Ah.
So we moved up to Green Bay, and I went to 5 different grade schools in Green Bay and a town called Manitowoc, Wisconsin, which most people will not have heard about, but you might have seen the big Manitowoc cranes at construction sites. My mother worked for a small newspaper publisher in Green Bay, um, Brown County Publishing, and they published the smaller of the 2 dailies in Green Bay, but they also owned weeklies all throughout Wisconsin and Northern Illinois, small town and rural weekly papers.
Sure.
And my stepfather, he was the political cartoonist for this daily, probably the hardest working political cartoonist in the country because most political cartoonists are not doing something every day. And he did one every single day. And then on Mondays, when during football season, they had a special extra session from Monday morning football. This was Green Bay. He would do another cartoon. So he was doing, between 6 and 8 cartoons every week, rarely
Wow.
took vacations. Um, and so anyway, I grew up going to their offices, and I grew up with, all kinds of printer paraphernalia that would make its way to our house, and as well as, of course, tons of magazines and newspapers. Well, the whole the whole realm of books and magazines and newspapers were a place, I guess, where my family lived. I mean, um, when I was in junior high school, I guess today it would be middle school, but back then, junior high school, I had a daily newspaper route, not for my parents' newspaper. We were living in a different town at that point, but I never saved a dollar from that thing that I did probably for like 2 years because what was it? Every 2 weeks, I would, do the collections. I'd then bike downtown, pay the bill at the newspaper place. And then I go, this is downtown Manitowoc, and there was a corner uh, right downtown, down the main street. In the basement was H.R. Liker's Books. And it was this used bookstore that had everything. And basically, any money I didn't spend down there, I mean, this was a time when I was just kind of really digging into like classic science fiction books and, all the Asimov and Heinlein stuff you were supposed to have read. I was getting into those. And you had tons of old magazines and comics and all that kind of stuff. So any money I didn't spend at Likers, I would then go up the stairs halfway down the block. And there was a Hallmark shop that also had paperbacks and huge selection of magazines. And so I might have had $20 to my name when I started that, and I'd walk out with maybe 50 cents, but lots of cool stuff to read.
I know that feeling. I spent every dime I had in my pocket on comic books, tops, movie and TV cards, and magazines. My dad always said money burned a hole in my pocket, and he was completely right.
What was your parents' attitude toward your comics and such? I mean, did they look down on it, or did they support it?
So my folks, it was interesting because n- n- they were both, they were neither one was a big fan of science fiction or any of that. My dad was a machinist. My mom spent a number of years until my sister and I were, older. She spent at home as an at home mom, and then went to work at the bank downtown in our little hometown. They were pretty conservative, relatively speaking. But I will say that they gave me a lot of leeway to be who I was and to kind of do what it was that I wanted to do and sort of pursue my own interests. So I was never that interested in sports, even though my little hometown was sports obsessed. It was football obsessed, throughout almost all year long, even though there was only, fall football season. But my folks, they didn't care that I didn't want to play sports. And I think that I often say that they were just happy that I had things I was interested in that could occupy my time, attention, and imagination.
You know,
Because I was kind of a nerdy kid. I was a little overweight. Bullied a bit in school. So anything that could distract me from that stuff, I think they were okay with. And then I did get, as I got older, I got involved with extracurricular stuff at school in the arts. And then, I found my voice, and everything really kind of shifted into a much better way. And all because I think they really gave me that latitude, which, in hindsight, it, it's kind of interesting that they would do that given their backgrounds. And my parents, as I'm sure yours were, Depression era or just right after Depression era kids themselves. So, the fact that you would do something that might seem frivolous, was, it was not necessarily the first thing that came to mind for either of them. Now, that said, it was expected that I was going to have a job as soon as I was old enough. And that was sort of the compromise. I still had to do that. Um, but there was never a moment where I felt like they weren't supportive of the person that I was and what I was interested in. And then when I wanted to go to film school as my undergrad, there again, they were completely supportive, which was not something that I think would have been in a lot of parents' wheelhouse at the time. So I lucked out.
Yeah. I mean, my parents were, I mean, my dad was a trained singer and musician. And he later became a piano tuner, and that is what he did for the last, 40 years or so of his life. He had a great living at that. My mother was an artist and writer and, she worked in newspapers and magazines. But I think there was also, people can disagree with this, but I mean, I've heard it enough from others that I think it's probably, there's something to it. And that is the 70s and 80s were also a time where kids didn't have every minute of their lives programmed.
That's right.
So, some of it was, yeah, you just had to fill up time because you were bored out of your skull. Other times it was, yeah, you went out and whether you had friends or you didn't have friends, but you kind of went out and did stuff. And sometimes it was stupid stuff. Sometimes it was great stuff that turned out to be really useful or whatever. But I think that kind of experience is very useful and important for kids' lives.
Yeah, I think so. I think so too. I had a very active imagination. I loved Star Trek. I loved Star Wars. I was very much a sci-fi kid. And my dad, interestingly enough, my dad, I discovered later in life when he was a kid, the same bookstore I would go to get my comic books, he would go to when he was a kid and get his comic books, but his were, all westerns, and that was his genre. So I think on one hand, our interests were very different, but on the other hand, he understood that sort of notion of a thing you really love.
Yeah.
Um, Although it was horrible having conversations with my dad about fantastic ideas like, what if somebody invented a time machine? My dad was very straightforward. He'd be like, no one's going to do that. That's not possible. Very practical. Um,
Um,
but but he taught me, by doing that, he taught me that it's okay if someone else doesn't have the same interest or agree.
yeah.
Doesn't stop me at all from, I would write my short stories. And when I read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I discovered what I considered to be sort of the pinnacle of comedy writing in science fiction form, and then tried to emulate that Douglas Adams style for years.
Yeah. My mother actually brought home Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And so we all read it and loved
Uh,
it. And she'd bring home the next one when it was published. And yeah, I wouldn't consider her a science fiction fan, but she clearly had a certain amount of taste for it. And then when Star Trek: The Next Generation came on, she actually did become a fan of that. She loved that. She watched it all the time. So,
oh, that's wonderful.
yeah.
Yeah, my parents definitely not Star Trek people, but they indulged me there too. They let me watch Star Trek. I was in college though when Next Generation premiered, so there was no one. I was amongst friends at that point, and we all tuned in to Next Generation religiously.
It was also a time where stuff that had been relegated to the cultural ghetto, if you will, people looking down on comics, people looking down on science fiction. It's all, crazy bug-eyed monsters and B movies and, cheap production values. And then it becomes this top-rated series. I mean, Star Trek: Next Generation was the top-rated syndicated series in the country at a time when syndication was just really exploding. Um, and you did have a lot of people. I know other people, friends of mine who were not science fiction fans, but were drawn into Star Trek: The Next Generation, and then kind of carried into later Trek series.
Well, so all this ties back to Starlog, right? Because
Hmm.
Starlog, especially in the first couple of years, was I mean, it was, if I'm not mistaken, it started sort of with the premise of what's happening with Star Trek. So, like, what drew you to Starlog, um, in addition to just your, your love of the genre and sci-fi?
I've read a lot of magazines and subscribed to a lot throughout my life. And as I mentioned, my mother, occasionally bring home book. She also would subscribe to like Isaac Asimov's magazine press and such. But Starlog was the first magazine that was like really mine. And, I started seeing it in the bookstore, actually in the grocery store, Stengel's Super Value in Manitowoc, Wisconsin, where my mother did her Saturday grocery shopping.
We had a super value. Yep.
Yep. And, I'd pick it up and page through it, and I didn't have enough allowance available for it, so I wouldn't buy it until finally I did. And it was the May 1980 issue with Galactica 1980 on the cover. And I bought that issue. I read it cover to cover. And that was the first time, and really perhaps the only time I've ever picked up a magazine. It's like, this is it. This magazine is treating something that is just like truly central to me, to my psyche, to my soul, and it's treating it intelligently.
Yeah.
And, it was really good reporting. Before that, of course, previous generations or just older people of our generation would have read Famous Monsters of Filmland, which had
Hmm.
started in the late 50s and kind of died then, I guess, in the early 1980s. But Famous Monsters was just something I could never get into. I would see that at the store and kind of like, I would want to, you know, pick it up and read it or whatever. It's covering science fiction. It's covering
Right.
monster movies and such. Fantastic Films over here is doing similar stuff, and they're doing real interviews and articles. Um, but Famous Monsters, it was a weird mixture of like rewriting press releases and just someone writing whatever they thought off the top of their head. And it's like, on the other hand, then here's Starlog with professional journalists going out there and showing you how movies are made.
Talking to the
Uh,
people who were writing and shaping those stories,
yeah,
which that's what I always loved, the behind the scenes look at what was informing the people creating those shows, which made them human beings. I was able to see myself in them, which up until then there was this, chasm between me and the people who did the things I loved. Now I could hear firsthand what they were thinking, why they did certain things, and even when they were doubtful about the longevity of what they were doing. I remember there was a moment when, Gil Gerard was being interviewed about Buck Rogers, and he talked openly about how unhappy he was with the way that a character was written in the first season of the show, which I loved the way Buck Rogers was written in the first season of the show, and I thought the second was terrible. But it was he apparently pushed so hard as the star of the show to become more serious. I remember reading that interview and thinking, "Ooh, that he's saying the quiet part out loud in print. Like, the writers are gonna read that."
right.
And I'm sure it did not, make him the most popular person on the series at that point.
I'm sure. In fact, we know it didn't because I think it was at the story editor of Buck Rogers that first season later wrote an article for Starlog, kind of a behind the scenes compilation of funny things that had happened to him. But it included some references to one of the actors who, always complained and made things difficult for the writers.
We will be right back. Hydration plus hygiene equals human dignity. Thursdeighties is sponsored by drivebydogooder's.org. With no overhead, no agenda, and pure giving, Drive By Do-Gooders provides basic human necessities to those living in downtown Los Angeles and homeless encampments around the city, particularly the elderly and disabled and their pets. Founded in 2015 by Licia Naff, with the goal of filling in the gaps where public welfare services fall short, Drive By Do-Gooders does exactly that. They drive to the needy and displaced, handing out essentials, water, wipes, socks, snacks, feminine products, masks, tarps, blankets, and more to those who have little or no access to basic human needs. Drive-By Do-Gooder's mission is to help as many people as possible, bringing relief to those who need it the most. The homeless epidemic can seem overwhelming, but even small gestures can go a long way to help those in need to find more permanent solutions. You can help Drive-By Do-Gooders to continue this important work and expand their reach. Go to drivebydogooders.org to learn more and donate, because hydration plus hygiene equals human dignity. drivebydogooders.org. Back to the show.
But I mean, in a positive way of really kind of getting to know the writers and the creators was, and probably the most famous example at Starlog was publisher Terry O'Quinn's big 3-part interview with George Lucas in 1981. And I've talked to Kerry about this, and he said it was really difficult to set up. So he would, contact Lucasfilm, and Starlog had really good relationships with the studio, whether it was a publicist or certain people in different positions in the executive suite. They knew how to get good photos, and they knew how to help set up interviews because they were favored on the films, and they were a reliable journalism outlet for the studios to work with. But what he was told every time he tried to reach, to set up an interview with George Lucas was, George Lucas does not do interviews, because to him, the interviews were things like with People magazine and things like that. He's like, and I don't want to sit and talk about, how much money Star Wars has made me, or, what happened to my marriage or anything like that.
Right.
And Kerry just kept at it and kept at it. And finally he's like, look, our readers don't care about that stuff. They want to know what inspires you. What, why did you make this film? How did you make this film? And so, okay, you've got an hour to talk to him. So Kerry flies out to I don't know, I guess it was up Northern California, where Lucasfilm was based at that time. And, goes in, and they start talking, and they could just go way past an hour. I think it was like a 3 hours interview, and it becomes a 3-part section in the magazine. But it really also, people should dig it up. It's worth going to eBay and just buying those 3 issues from 1981 for that, if nothing else, because you really see George Lucas, probably for the first time, talking about, what really inspires him, and not just kind of like the little bits that, the mainstream media might kind of pepper in through an article that really wants to talk about what car he drives or whatever. It was in depth, it was intelligent, and it was absolutely absorbing. And yes, that was what Starlog was doing that just made the reader, if LA Law made people kind of talk about the episode, the next day around the water cooler, that kind of interview was the thing that you would want to talk about with your friends, or you'd want to show your parents and say, hey, this is why I read this stuff.
It was inspiration to try our own stuff. I had friends who had their 8mm cameras and all kinds of aspirations to make their own fan films based on whether it was Star Trek or Star Wars or anything. And being able to hear the voice of the people doing this work on a professional basis was inspiring to the amateurs, because it felt like, I could do this. I, certainly don't have access to all the great stuff that they do, but, I'm breathing oxygen just like they are. I put my pants on one leg at a time, just like they do.
Right.
I can talk about this subject with anybody just like they can. So I can do it. And I also loved that there were in Starlog, they would include some science discoveries and things that, while they might be adjacent to sci-fi, felt very much like foundational to the content or the stories that were being told, because it was always related in some way. But it was a TV and movie magazine focused on science fiction, but it never shied away from touching on real science too, which I loved.
Yeah, I got to know Kerry O'Quinn years later, around, was it 1999, 2000, somewhere in there, where I interviewed him for a science fiction TV column I was writing for Aaron Barnhart's TV Barn newsletter. And so we kind of became friends, and we stayed in touch, and I've interviewed him since then. So he's talked about the origin story of Starlog, which, as you noted, started off as it was going to be a one-shot magazine based on about Star Trek, and it was actually being done by another publisher who was going to pay Norman Jacobs and Kerry O'Quinn to produce this for him. And then during the process of it, this other publisher suddenly realized, oh, wait a minute, um, that Star Trek thing is probably copyrighted, so we can't really just totally devote a magazine to it without paying a license fee. He was unwilling to do it. He said, you guys just keep that stuff. And so Kerry O'Quinn and Norman Jacobs and their staff, David Houston, who was the editor, and others were kind of sitting around saying, well, what do we do with this stuff? We've already paid for the writers. We've already done the layouts and such. And so they decided well, let's see if we can make this a going thing. We know Kerry O'Quinn was a science fiction fan before that. David Houston was. And they only had one other magazine at the time that was any success, and that was a soap opera magazine called Daily TV Serials.
Huh.
And it was very much a Starlog type magazine. If you read it, if you look at it, I've seen copies of it and just kind of go through, you see really kind of the same minds at work and how they presented it, which was instead of just kind of surface coverage of the soap operas, they were talking to the writers and the actors and the producers, and they were doing previews of upcoming seasons, and they were doing retrospectives, and they were doing reviews of things. And it was about the making of these things. And it wasn't just like a fan thing of, oh, here's a bunch of pretty pictures. Well, so they went to their distributor, because back then, in magazines, when you're a newsstand magazine, it's the distributor who really kind of is God. And they said, we want to do this science fiction magazine. Of course, the distributor said, you're an idiot. You're going to lose your shirt. And they said, no, we really think, Kerry O'Quinn did all this research on Star Trek fan clubs and science fiction conventions. He said, look, there's an audience out there. And just like with soap operas, before we started daily TV serials, no one's taking them seriously. No one's, again, Famous Monsters was out there, but it was, and I'm sorry for your listeners who are fans of Famous Monsters, but, it was jokey. It was filled with puns and
Right.
It wasn't deep reporting. And Kerry said, no, we're going to do reporting. We're going to do, real in-depth stuff and treat this seriously. And so the distributor said, okay, we'll let you do that, but you can't do it monthly because I think you're going to lose your shirt. So you'll do it quarterly so that, by the time the second issue is ready to go, we'll know if the first one worked. And if it didn't, there's not going to be a second issue. Anyway, they launched it. And what they did was they took the content that they had created for that all Star Trek thing and broke it up. So the first issue of Starlog is roughly maybe 50% Star Trek, and then other stuff like Bionic Woman and Squirm and Big King Kong. And then in the second issue, though the cover story was Space 1999, there was also a lot of Star Trek stuff. And then the third issue, I think, was kind of when they used up the rest of it. But of course, by the third issue, they really knew they were going to be a success because that first issue had almost sold out.
Wow.
And so within a year, they were announcing they were going from quarterly to 8 times a year. So they were doubling their frequency, and they rapidly started to then increasing the number of pages and the color, the more and more color in the magazine, adding David Gerald as a columnist and all this kind, making real commitments to this thing as an ongoing thing as it quickly became the publication. And I think, again, in the late 70s when it launched, there was nothing like it. Cinefantastique was published actually far from where I am here in Chicago, did exist. I think it was a quarterly back then. Also a very small publication and just focused on film and TV, and did some great stuff. In fact, again, eBay hunters check for their Star Wars double issue. I mean, it's pretty cool. But Starlog it was a small magazine.
Right.
In the genre of science fiction, it was king of the hill.
Yeah.
And this was this big, colorful thing saying that, hey, science fiction has arrived. And it wasn't just a blip from Star Trek. It got a huge boost from when Star Wars came out, but it also wasn't just that. It was all these other TV series. And they did that great mix of, they being the publisher and editors, of including the new stuff, but then also reporting on old stuff. And I've always liked magazines that did that. That
Yeah.
because it was kind of it's interesting. If you can make an article interesting, I'll read it. I don't care whether it's doesn't have to be something I particularly identify with. But also, it's saying everyone's welcome here. You know,
Right.
whether you're one of the new wave science fiction fans of the late '60s and early '70s, or you're one of the classic Heinlein and Sturgeon and Asimov fans, or you're coming in later, you're Vonda McIntyre, you're all welcome.
You mentioned Vonda McIntyre, so she's probably my favorite. Well, she was probably my favorite author of Star Trek books.
Mhm.
So, and here again is I think one of the reasons why a Starlog magazine was as popular as it was, and compared to today when you have access to everything behind the scenes, everything through DVD supplemental materials and books and but and expanded universes for everything we love. Back then, you had just the source material. So Star Wars, okay, there was a Star Wars movie. Then there was the Alan Dean Foster Splinter of the Mind's Eye. And it
Right.
was like, wow, there's a new bit of Star Wars. And there was a Marvel comic, but but there was so little content outside of the actual source material. So having a Starlog that allowed you to expand your view of those things was amazing. But was around that time too. Well, actually, it was earlier than the '80s, but '70s, '80s, and even till today, to some extent, authors writing books expanding the universe of the things we loved, like Star Wars and Star Trek. Vonda McIntyre wrote a book called The Entropy Effect, which is probably my favorite Star Trek novel of all time, and one that I wish they had been able to find a way to make an episode out of. Um, but the anyway, I loved her. She did the novelizations too for Star Trek 2 and I think 3, among other works that she wrote. The very first time I had email, I found her email address. I think she was teaching at the University of Washington. I
Really?
found her email address and I emailed her, basically out of the blue, essentially an email love note about how much I loved the entropy effect and, completely excluding all of the other stuff she'd written, but focused on that. And she wrote me the nicest note back about how much she loved writing Star Trek books in general, but that story in particular. But it was conversations with people like that, was reading about those conversations in Starlog that taught me that you could have conversations yourself with these folks. Like, they weren't deities, they were people. And I spent a lot of my time growing up, like finding ways to reach out to people I respected or was interested in. Most of the time I wouldn't get a response, but
Mhm.
sometimes I would.
Yeah.
And I learned that largely from Starlog.
There was a book that came out, a nonfiction book get when it was. I don't, unfortunately, do not remember the title, but it was in the late '70s, early '80s. It was a collection of interviews with science fiction writers.
Mhm.
Some of the authors you would expect because they're big names, and others you didn't know. But it really was great because it wasn't just a Q&A of, why did you write this book, blah, blah, blah. It was talking to them and visiting them at their home. And that was for me where I really kind of like, these are normal people. They're not living in an ivory tower. They're, some of them working another job while they're writing books. And, oh, wow. Okay. So you don't become rich just by writing
Right.
really well received books or whatever. And it's interesting about Vonda McIntyre and the, the entropy effect. I mean, that came out in 1981. And I think that was the summer I was staying with my dad and his wife down in outside Madison. And I found I could read an entire paperback book in a day. And I read so many books that summer of have lots of science fiction, but also, other stuff. That
Sure.
was Stephen King's Dance Macabre was, I think, one of the books I grabbed. But there was a used bookstore, used paperback bookstore, maybe a mile or two away from where they lived. And I must have been their biggest customer that year because
That was your crack cocaine den right there.
I would go there, I'd, return some books that I had gone through and buy some more and, nothing really cost all that much. Then I'd go home and I would just have awesome stuff. And, um, I suspect people who would have thought that any teenage boy would be out, doing sports and stuff like that would think, what the heck is he doing? Spending all day reading. And it was probably my favorite summer ever because of that.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a wealth of material, and I think it was in the '80s when I discovered, there was a lot more behind the scenes material than I ever knew existed. Actually, one of the best behind the scenes books is a book called The Jaws Log, and it's all about the making of the movie Jaws, I think it's written by Carl Gottlieb. And it's basically he kept a journal while they were making the movie Jaws, which he then turned into a book. But I think it was published. I don't know if I think it was published several years after the movie, but it was one of the first books I read, that just focused on the. It didn't focus on the why this was a fun movie, a great movie, a scary movie. It was the mechanics of the day to day, door to door battles of getting good stuff on the page, translating that to great stuff on the screen, um, through, and it was hard work, and that's how it came across. This was not as glamorous as it may seem when you go see a movie. The actual work that goes into it, while satisfying, is hard work, and that's something else I saw in Starlog. When you'd have a production designer or a filmmaker or a producer, kind of agonizing about whether or not they could ultimately put something on the screen that people wanted to see, especially when they were handling legacy material like Star Trek. It really drove home that these were being created by people that, like us, loved what they did. They loved the genre. They loved the story, and always gave me the sense that someday I could do that. But until that time, this stuff is in good hands.
I think I've always appreciated the stories about the failures as well.
Hmm.
And those are the ones that really made me feel bad for the people who were involved because, you're a lighting designer, you're a costume designer, you're a special effects chief or whatever, or you're the star, or you're the writer, you're the cop, whatever your role is, this is what you're trained to do, right? You're in the one place in the world where everyone who does what you do most wants to be.
Right.
And you're working on this movie that's costing tens of millions of dollars back then, maybe 15 million. And when it turns out to be a turkey and everyone is just tearing it apart,
Hmm.
and it's like, none of the people there set out to make a bad movie.
Right. And they put blood, sweat, and tears every day into trying to make the best thing they could.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's gotta really, really hurt because of course, if it's a big success, it also helps everyone's career
Right.
is helped. And if it's turkey because of nothing that they did, bad marketing or the studio decided, no, we're going to this alien movie with Ridley Scott. Let's look at it as a comedy. It's whatever. Which of course did that. It's stuff that you didn't have any control over, but it can still kill your career or stunt it or not give you the boost that you thought. And then you also have to see this thing that you really thought was going to be a great movie turn out to be terrible.
Yeah. Yeah. What's the old saying? Success has 1,000 fathers and failure has
As
one.
an orphan,
Failure's an orphan. Except that in that industry, the last thing you did sticks with you. Have you watched by chance the documentary series Light and Magic on Disney Plus about I think it's 6 episodes. It's the history of industrial light and magic.
Oh,
And the first 3 episodes are really focused on the creation of Star Wars up to, and then by the third or fourth episode, now they're getting into more contemporary CGI and the introduction of CGI in Jurassic Park. But those first 3 episodes of that docu-series, especially the first 2, those felt like Starlog on screen to me because it was compiled with lots and lots of behind the scenes, the home movies, but the people they were interviewing were the people who were on the ground in the really hot warehouse trying to figure out how to make an explosion look good, building, the Dijkstraflex from the ground up, which had never been done before. But I saw in that series the spirit of Starlog. And I felt if Starlog was still being published today, and I think it stopped publishing in 2009,
2009. Yeah.
Yeah. But if it was still being published today, it would have expanded to a lot of different media, and in particular would have been fascinating as a producer of docuseries about the, sci-fi film, TV, very much in the vein of what they did in print. But I really loved hearing the voices of these people, and I think that enriched the story too. Reading them in Starlog was great. Hearing their voice and the sort of nostalgia that they had for that moment in time when they were, young, uh, trying to figure out how they were going to be the kind of artist they wanted to be, and it was just fascinating to me. It again felt like an extension of that Starlog universe, even though it was on Disney Plus.
Well, and Starlog, the publishers of the magazine, quickly kind of gobbled up every adjacent product area that they could move into. So they were doing original LP records, with re-recording famous film soundtracks, and obviously T-shirts and hats and stuff like that. But also this trade paperback series, the Starlog guidebooks, which of course I couldn't afford at the time, but collected all of them once I could get them. And they did one called Space Art. It's filled with space art from artists around the world, and it was this 200-page thing, all color.
Ooh.
And it was such a big deal that when Omni premiered, its second issue had a big excerpt out of it. Reader's Digest had a big excerpt out of it. I mean, Reader's Digest was the biggest magazine in the world at that time.
Yeah.
And here, this fairly small publishing company was having this reach because they understood that it wasn't just a magazine.
Right.
They eventually got into doing conventions, and had Kerry O'Quinn not left in the late '80s, I suspect they would have gotten into television because he actually did have a TV series in pre-production or whatever, I guess, with HBO, and that didn't work out. And again around 1999 or 2000, I guess it was in 2000. I got to tour actually their offices with Kerry O'Quinn. I was having lunch with him, and then he would kind of have to go to the office. And even though he no longer worked there, he obviously was still welcome there.
Still has some pull.
Yeah. So we went up, and it was like, yeah, it's an office. It was people and desks and bulletin boards and such. But it was an office where people were creating science fiction
Right.
and horror magazines. That was the Fangoria office. And David McDonald, the long time editor of Starlog, with his beautiful corner office, the walls lined with books. Couldn't believe it. I could have spent hours just going through his books. It was an office where I guess kind of magic happened in the same way that in the film world, ILM, it's a factory floor, and that they made magic.
They're at ground zero of this amazing thing. And it's funny because I imagine if you're working there and you're there day to day, that novelty may wear off for you. It's a job, it's a desk, it's whatever. But you being able to breathe a little bit of that rare air for a minute had to be really exciting.
It was neat. David Hutchinson was their special effects editor and their science editor. And, we popped in and we were chatting with him briefly, and he had a cartoon attached to his board from Howard Cruz, who was this award-winning former underground cartoonist who was briefly an art director for Starlog, went on to do lots of comics, and all kind of a whole bunch of genres. But in the 1990s, he published his kind of semi-autobiographical graphic novel called Stuck Rubber Baby, which became this huge success and well earned. I mean, he was winning awards, and I was really pleased because in a different job of mine, I got to hire him to design one of our covers. And so we did, phone calls with him, and he was just the sweetest person you can imagine. Yeah. And so anyway, I was able to kind of bring that up with David Hutchins. It's like, oh, I've, talked with him, and he's such a nice guy.
So you're still in touch with a lot of these folks. Carrie's still with us, I take it. And
Gary is in Los Angeles. He calls himself semi-retired. He, of course, moved there in actually about the same time I moved out of New York and went to California. Um, and he kind of dabbled in the film industry. I know he owned the rights to an Ayn Rand story for a while. He's a big Ayn Rand fan, as you readers of his editorials know from time to time. Um, David McDonald actually was going to start a new line of magazines, actually. This was a few years ago, and including one that would not be Starlog, but would be very similar to it. And so I wrote some stuff for that, and unfortunately, it didn't ever come out to be. So Mark Bernardine, you might know, been very
Sure.
stuff comics. He also done a long running podcast series on Battlestar Galactica, the new Battlestar Galactica. Um, and the kind of like before, we were talking about people who were like that was a time that they really kind of remembered and a place. There does seem to be this real affection for them,
Yeah.
for the Starlog years, if you will, among their careers, even though if they were writers and editors there, they were not being paid well, or at least they were never being paid enough. Let's say
Sure.
that. But they did get to meet famous people and interview famous people, and of course, kind of have a group of adoring fans who kind of thought they were really awesome people because
Right.
they saw their names in the magazines every month. Like I saw their names in the magazine every month. So yeah, it sounds like it truly was kind of a neat place to work and a neat time.
What ultimately what led you to write the compendium? What made you say now's the time? And this was it was published in 2022, so a couple of years ago. What led you to that? Because that's a lot of work. Number one, and number two, um, I'm gonna guess you weren't expecting to get rich from it, but a labor of love is what comes to mind.
Yes. Well, I had published a book a year or two earlier on science fiction, basically some episode guides
Mhm.
and stuff that I had largely written earlier when I was kind of producing some digital magazines. Um,
Galaxis?
Galaxis, which is a magazine you can find on a site called isuu.com. And it was really more just an attempt for me to kind of have fun with it and see,
Sure.
well, what could I do in that? And I wasn't trying to say that this is a professional magazine at Starlog's level, but kind of like if I were doing a magazine, this is the kind of stuff I would include in it.
Yeah, listeners, he's being modest because I did take a look at Galaxis and I thought it was fantastic.
Yep.
I will make sure to let folks know where they can see it because I loved it.
Well, thank you. But anyway, so I pulled together some of those things and then added other stuff. And then, of course, wrote around it and produced a book called Science Fiction by the Hour.
Mm.
It's Star Trek: The Next Generation, Battlestar Galactica of all versions, and the first season of X-Files. Just kind of exploring both, not just giving synopsis of the stories, but trying to also put them in the context of their time, what was going on in the science fiction field, especially during Star Trek: The Next Generation, when so much was changing, and it was changing so much else in the field. And after I did that, and I got pretty good response to it, certainly not monetarily, but I mean, feedback was good.
It's a theme.
Um, yeah. And now this you might have heard about, or you may not have. I don't know if this was a big thing in Virginia, but there was something called a pandemic where,
Rings a bell. Rings a bell.
yeah, okay, kids look it up. Uh, and so working at home, luckily I still had a job, but I also had by that time caught the bug of, yeah, I can publish a book, self-publish a book. Um, and as I said earlier, I had started doing these Starlog write-ups on a blog that I no longer updated because blogs kind of had their moment. So I figured, okay, well, let me flesh that out. And I did. And so for those listeners who don't know, Starlog ranked with 374 issues. And to get a book length, I figured I needed to do about half that. And eventually there will be a Starlog Compendium Volume 2, which will include the rest of Starlog. And then I'll also put in the Future Life Compendium. But I pulled that together and then started writing stuff. And actually, toward the end of that production was when David McDonald was going to do his magazines. And one of the things I did for him was he was going to do kind of a history of Starlog. And so for him, I interviewed my friend Carrie O'Quinn again. And so some of that actually worked its way into the introduction to this book. Published the book and sent it off, and it's had quite a nice feedback, including from Starlog people.
That's
And
great.
Lee Goldberg, who was a prolific writer and is now this unbelievably successful mystery and thriller writer,
Yes.
bestseller, pretty much everything he writes. He was nice enough one day, he'll occasionally like hold up on Facebook, he'll share photos of himself holding up books that he's just gotten. And he did that for one of them. I was like, that was a good day when I saw that.
That's awesome. I bought it for my iPad. So I will get an actual copy of it, physical copy, because I still love the tactile feel of a book. But I got it when I first discovered it on Amazon. I'm like, well, I want to read it right now. And so I started flipping through, and that inspired me to buy the issue of Starlog. You see the background there, issue 1, because I've always wanted it, but I for the life of me, I hadn't really thought about it for a number of years. And then I found every issue in your compendium that I had bought when I was a kid. And so I was like reliving this moment, this glory day moment where I can still remember walking into the bookstore and seeing a new issue on the shelf, especially their compendium issues when they would have, I can't remember if it was like the 100th.
Their July issues for a number of years, they would do the last year in Starlog.
That was the most exciting issue for me every time, and I would save my money for that because
Really?
it was just so chock full, and it was like double
Yeah.
thick.
100 pages.
So I, of course, went through and found all of those. So anyway, bottom line is the compendium was it was a fantastic resource for me as a Starlog fan and as a reader, and I would recommend it to anybody who, even if you just have an interest in 80s journalism, sci-fi journalism, old school magazine publishing, it's a great resource for all of that. And I really, really love it. And I can't wait to see volume 2.
Well, thank you for saying that. It was certainly fun to do. Now, volume 2, I don't have any of it written yet, so that will take a while to pull together. But I'm sure it'll be fun to do once I get into it.
Well, John, I know we need to wrap up, but I did want to ask you, like, what are you doing now, and what's next for you? You've been very generous with your time here, but I would love to hear what you're up to.
Well, a number of things. One is I've interviewed science fiction writers and scientists a number of times over the years. I've got a number of interviews I decided I'll pull them together into a book. I mean, I've interviewed John Scalzi twice. I've interviewed David Gerald twice, as well as some scientists like Leonard Susskind and Michio Kaku and others. So kind of a nice mix, again, a crossover of science and science fiction together. And with Dr. Kaku, in particular, we were talking about science fiction. He's a huge fan, in particular, a Star Trek fan. So as I get the time, I will be pulling that together into a book. And again, at some point, there will be a compendium issue. Let's call it episode 2. And then in my normal life, I have a full-time job where I'm running the media department at a venerable nonprofit in San Francisco called the Commonwealth Club of California.
And I think I saw you were launching a new magazine, San Francisco magazine.
Yes, I'm also editor-in-chief of a new nonprofit news organization in San Francisco called The Voice of San Francisco, which is kind of trying to come up with both reporting on and talking about kind of ways to help revive that city and take care of some of the issues that it's dealing with. Is I think they're probably kind of famous. Pretty much all big cities have been getting a bad rap for the past few years, and some of it's deserved and some of it's not. So we'll be getting into that. So I've got a lot on my plate. I wouldn't expect the compendium volume 2 to come out next month, but eventually it'll hit the store.
Well, fantastic. It exhausts me just to hear everything that you've got on your plate. I feel completely like an underachiever now. So again, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and for giving insights on Starlog and your connection to it and the compendium, of course, and also just knowing what you're doing in your day job and what you're doing with the Voice of San Francisco, like taking your talent and ability and applying it to doing the world some good is also pretty fantastic, and I appreciate that as well, and I'm sure my listeners do too.
Well, thank you, and I hope everyone kind of gets a chance to both pay their bills and to kind of pursue dreams and hope making the world a little bit better.
Yeah, that's the dream, right?
Yeah.
All right, my friend. Well, thanks again, and
Thank you.
I look forward to episode 2 of the compendium when it comes out, and
Amazing.
watching what else you produce.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Bill.
Thanks, John. Well, John was so much fun to talk to. Check out his magazine, Galaxus, at issuu.com. That's issuu.com. Galaxus is it's a beautiful online magazine, and it's a wonderful homage to Starlog. Oh, and when John mentioned that he had spent some time in his childhood in Manitowoc, Wisconsin, the first thing that popped into my head was the Manitowoc Minute with comedian Charlie Berens. If you want a taste of authentic northern Midwestern living, you'll find a bunch of Charlie Berens videos on YouTube. They're worth going down the YouTube rabbit hole. Okay, friends. I will try my best to set aside my procrastination, put it off for another day, and bring you the next few episodes of Thursdeighties much faster. I've had some very special conversations that I can't wait to share with you, so be on the lookout. In the meantime, go to anthologyforbooks.com. That's anthology, the number 4, books.com. Connect with Beth and Jim. Also, go to drivebydogooders.org and donate to this very important mission. See you next time. Happy spooky season, my friends.